So we'll see if he's up for more. But we have everyone. I'm not quite sure. Maybe Don just wanted to join for the first one. And why don't you, I will reach out to Don and maybe you can.
Yes, I could start the introductions here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. As we have our other panelists soon joining in. Anne, nice to see you. And
likewise.
Just as we do in all of our panels, I would go around our panelists and ask you to introduce yourself and then talk about your work in the COVID space. And then we'll start with the Q&A.
Perfect. So I'm Ann Mond Johnson. I'm CEO of the American Telemedicine Association, the ATA, based in DC. I would say that this has really been an incredible time in terms of the pandemic and what that means for technology and policy. Simply put, I think that the best way to characterize it is that the regulations are slowly, hopefully permanently catching up with what technology can do. And I think we've all seen that despite hiccups, despite surges, that the underlying trends were available or they were present before. And what's happened is that COVID really was accelerant and really fueled all of this very, very quickly. So we're seeing a lot of innovation going on in the industry. You heard from Leslie Kriegstein from Livongo. There's a lot of innovation happening with the delivery systems in terms of how they're responding. And we're also seeing a rapid adoption of asynchronous as well as synchronous tools and remote monitoring. And I think that what is not well understood is that the healthcare system in the US was pretty close to collapsing. And I'd submit that technology saved us.
Great. We might be able to quote you on that. That was our AED device right there. Mm-hmm. With that, I would like to also welcome Damika. Am I pronouncing your name right? Because my name gets butchered all the time. So, okay, excellent. So Damika, if you could introduce yourself and share your work in COVID space, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Damika Barr, Public Policy and Government Relations Lead for Verily Life Sciences. Verily is the healthcare and life sciences company of Alphabet. We have developed 3 products in response to COVID: Pathfinder, which is a tool to support hospitals and health systems, our baseline community-based testing tool, and our latest tool is called Healthy at Work, Healthy at School, which is helping with workplace safety and university safety as we reopen.
All right, so I know that Rajiv is right next on my panel. Rajiv, I know there are some people who are new, so if you can briefly introduce yourself, and then we go to a next panelist.
Yeah, I'm a physician currently working at the VA hospital in Palo Alto, formerly of the San Francisco Health Department for 20 years. I was a deputy health officer there. Worked on basically all sorts of policy analysis, legislation, regulation, and emergency response for 20 years.
Great. And are you actively treating COVID in your practice at this time?
I am. Thursdays, tomorrow, I'm in charge of our COVID exposure clinic, which is all of the many reasons people come in for a test.
Okay, that's great. And I also want to welcome Ed to our panelists. Ed, please join us. You might have to unmute yourself and then introduce and share your experience with COVID.
Great. Thanks for having me today.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah, this has been a great event so far, and thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be with all of you, some of whom I've met before. So I work at a company called Lyfomic. We're a 3-year-old company. We have really 2 things. We have a precision health cloud-based, 100% cloud-based data platform that can take in genomic data, phenotypic data, social data, electronic health record data, and synthesize that data to come out with insights on how we can diagnose and treat patients. We started with one of the harder use cases being cancer, and we have specifically honed in on some very difficult to diagnose and as far as tumor of origin is concerned, as well as treat cancer. And we've been largely research-based in our approach. We have a couple dozen scientists on our staff, and then we have computer scientists and programmers and full stack developers at the company. On the other side, we're really focused on wellness, longevity, and activating people so that they can improve their health status. We have 2 apps that are available in the app stores. One is around fasting, and one is called Life Extend, which the whole idea behind that is to help people with healthy habits, really simplify healthy habits down for people. And we use gamification and machine learning and things to help people be healthier. And we have over 2.5 million users across the world, and our apps are in multiple languages now. And then as an adjunct, we also have a telehealth function within our apps, as well as we can use it for telehealth, and we can use it for coaching as well. And then we also have a great platform that is, it's an educational platform. And what it's meant to do is boil down very complex medical and scientific ideas and facts and things into understandable snippets of information that can be imparted to people to help them understand, hey, this is complicated, but it really doesn't have to be that complicated. And our whole idea behind doing that is to bring together artists who are illustrators and great writers, narrators with scientists, because oftentimes there's a fissure, there's a chasm between those two worlds. And from a human-centered design perspective, I think it's really, really important that we marry those two things up and meet people where they are, especially as they're grappling with chronic conditions or getting fit, getting healthy, and improving their health status. So as you can imagine, a lot of what I just told you about is very relevant as we grapple with the pandemic. We have, we've put out a lot of courses, a lot of those educational courses that are around things like cytokine storms, for instance. So our body's immune response and how it can go overboard. Things about things that are geared toward teaching kids about the coronavirus. We came out with one of those very early on that was tweeted by a bunch of social media folks, promoters on Instagram and Twitter and things. And the idea that we want to impart is that we can do this in a non-confrontational, non-controversial and calming way. And so we continue to bring these courses out. We're doing some on vaccines and immunization as an example, helping people understand the science behind why it's important to be vaccinated. Teaching kids, you know, it's not going to hurt you, and things of that nature. So that's what I'm working on these days. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Lyfomic. Before that, I was with HHS. I reported to the secretary there, and I was the Chief Technology Officer, as well as the Acting Chief Information Officer for a year of my service there. And I was there for about 3 years. I left HHS in February and rejoined the private sector. And so I left at a time when I really didn't want to leave for a lot of reasons. And one was because of what we were going through, and we were just really, you know, ramping up in our response and our, understanding of the magnitude of what was going to happen, with the pandemic. I was able to pitch in and help early on in some of the things that were going on around HHS. One of the great things for me being in the position I was in is I had a nice wide lens view of what was going on across all 29 of the agencies and offices within HHS, including CDC, the NIH, FDA, CMS, the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, and other organizations. And wasn't a policy shop, and glad I wasn't a policy shop, wasn't a regulator, but really the whole idea behind the Office of the CTO, which was actually started under the Obama administration, was to work on a few things that were almost anathema to federal government in the past. So the first is public-private partnership. And that's been brought up multiple times here by folks with very divergent, I guess, political leanings, if you will. But I think that's something that we can all agree on, is that how important public-private partnership really is in solving some of these intractable issues. Another thing that I was responsible for was interfacing with startups across the health sector. So we went into 12 different cities that had vibrant health IT startup communities, incubators, accelerators, corporate innovation hubs, things of that nature. We pulled everyone together. We brought in leaders from the CDC, NIH, FDA. We had lightning round talks from high up people at these organizations. And then we had fast pitch sessions from local innovators, local entrepreneurs. And the whole idea here is the whole idea was to make HHS less opaque and seem less Byzantine, and say, hey, if you want to talk to somebody about something you're working on, if you have an idea, come to our office. We know the folks, we can put you in touch with them to accelerate your time to value on whatever you're working on. We also worked, we're also the hub for data at HHS. So healthdata.gov was started under the Office of the CTO and is still managed under the Office of the CTO, and that is was mandated by Congress as a place for open data. So all of the data that is generated by the offices and agencies within HHS is owned by taxpayers, and that's something that I feel very, very strongly about. Obviously, the data is heavily regulated as well through things like HIPAA, right, and other privacy laws, 42 CFR2, things like that, right? But I think sometimes we hide behind these laws or regulations, or we say, hey, it's just too hard for us to surface this data. But the more data that we can get out there in people's hands, the better. And we can unpack that later. But I was a big proponent of open data from the time that I set foot in HHS, and that was actually a clarion call started by folks like Anish Chopra and Todd Park, who was my predecessor in the CTO's office under Obama. And we see very much eye to eye on these things. We need to liberate as much data as we can to inform policy, to inform public health, especially during a pandemic. And fortunately, there are a lot of folks throughout federal government, both career folks that are not political hires or appointees, as well as political hires and appointees historically across both parties that feel very strongly about this. And there's kind of a posse, a health data posse of folks that I wish they could all be on this event today to hear all of the insights that all of you have brought.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the inside story from HHS so that now we have the panel that is in the private sector, in the governmental, represented equally almost at this time. So yeah, Bambi, back to you.
Yeah, I want to you know, Ed, obviously having been at HHS and also at a company that's doing now precision medicine, will obviously talk to you a lot more about how we can get the right data. How do we get precise data, first of all? Is precision medicine working, predictive analytics working? And then also, you know, can we make the state data interoperable with the government like CDC data? But we haven't really touched on this, so I want to bring Damika here because she's at Google Verily, and they're identifying clusters. Speaking of data, important data, identifying clusters, enabling people to get back to work. And so, Damika, there was a new article that came out in the Atlantic. If anybody reads that, I know, you know, sometimes some people don't agree, but it was pretty good. And it was talking about some super spreaders and basically saying that we were approaching this pandemic in the wrong way by looking at it as a flu pandemic versus a pandemic where you have these super spreaders. So when you look at the data, are you considering that? Are you trying to find the 20% that are responsible for the 80% of the cases?
So great question. So just a little background on the tool itself and who has the responsibility for making that determination. So Healthy at Work or Healthy at School is a tool that Verily has developed. It's a web portal. It allows for symptom tracking. It allows for the employee or the student to enter information about exposure. It may then direct them to testing. On the employer side of things, what they're going to see is they're going to have an understanding of, you know, which portion of their population is at a higher risk. Maybe they've been more exposed based on the information that they've submitted, or they can see some positive clusters. It would be the responsibility would then lie on the university or the employer to make these ultimate decisions on what they should do when reopening their university or maybe just a segment of their workforce.
Are you doing any back tracing when you find some of those positive clusters? Are you, and also to maybe to Ed and Rajiv, and you're familiar with the data, should they be doing back tracing when they find these clusters? But first, Damika, so you're identifying the positive clusters.
Yeah, so what we'll do is provide the population level analytics. It will be up to the employer or the university to make their own decisions, right? Following within the guidelines of their local public health authority on what the requirements would be for that area related to that cluster. That is not the decision of Verily.
So quick question as we extend that question across. How do you navigate the privacy and confidentiality aspect of adoption of your solution, both from the patient zero perspective and then also the contact tracing perspective? Damika, that's a question for you. When you identify a cluster.
Okay, sorry, I had missed the question due to some technical difficulties.
Oh, okay. No, yeah.
So yeah, so the analytics would help the employer understand the cluster, right? They're going to be the ones who would help understand how to segment their population, right? Whether it's by building, dormitory, lab, whatever that, the parameters that they set up, then they will see that within that space there is a cluster positive, a cluster of folks who are exposed or have been frequently exposed to people, maybe even outside of work.
And then to Ed and Rajiv and Anne, we'll get to you with regarding to unless you want to respond to this one, but this is more about because we haven't really talked about it. So I'm curious whether we should be doing more of that. And this to either Ed or Rajiv, if you want to.
Rajiv, why don't you start?
Yeah, why don't I think my perspective is pretty far off from where the mainstream is. I wouldn't be counting cases anymore. I think in our last epidemic, the CDC stopped counting cases in 2 months, and we started measuring syndromic hospital. The measures we should be doing are a combination of an illness like hospitalization with a lab count and a clinically relevant syndrome. There is to measure a laboratory test positivity when in young people you have up to 70% asymptomatic, low severe morbidity. What are we measuring? Why are we measuring this? Why are we anxious about this? Why are we obsessed about this? Other than it's a business opportunity. You know, it is astonishing the degree to which we've gone down this road, and we have not measured what's important. And by not measuring what's important, which are the disease, and again, the history of how we measure pandemics is all there. It's not that this was new, that we should focus on hospitalizations and deaths and not lab tests. We've just gone down a very different road. But when what we do is we count lab positive tests, we don't focus on what's important. So everybody thinks when case counts go up, case counts go up. And the case definition excluded illness explicitly that the CDC adopted. People get into a panic, and from the common person's perspective, more cases sound bad, right? But if those are not, but what's really happening is in nursing homes, we did not do what we could have done to prevent deaths going up in the nursing homes. We've had the same proportion of deaths in nursing homes, which is high, and the first wave is the second wave, which means we didn't intervene successfully. That's where we should be putting attention. If we follow deaths and hospitalizations, we would put attention on things that prevent deaths and hospitalizations. And in that way, we would be taking targeted strategies to prevent deaths and hospitalizations. So where's the vulnerability? Where's the exposure? Where's the intersection of vulnerability and exposure? And stop the vector of exposure from getting to the vulnerable person. It's the intersection that you want to deal with. If you look at Cal Vet homes, as of July, 2 deaths compared to thousands in California, right? It can be done, all of this can be done. It just hasn't been done. And case counts and lab test counts, they're a distraction.
So, hey, Rajiv, so, the science says that there are phases of pandemic in which, yes, case counts can be relevant when you catch it early on. But then there is a pivot that, scientifically, the industry or the health system needs to do and educate people like, hey, we are stopping to look at case counts because we're past that stage of pandemic. Now we're focused on our vulnerable. So that conversation hasn't really happened. And Johns Hopkins has been the news of the day, which tells you the case counts and all of that. So bringing that question to Ed, right? You're at the center of all this. How did you approach this? Because, in February, we were going from case count to now protect the vulnerable scenario.
So I agree with what Rajiv said. I think we're past the point where raw case counts and population level case counts are what we should be focused on. I think a lot of people would, the media, for instance, some policymakers and others, if we stopped doing that, there would be mutiny and a lot of very, very upset people, because a lot of people predicate their stories, their clickbait, their social media, all that good stuff on that very vector or factor. The one place where I'm interested in hearing, the rest of the folks, their opinions on this, I go back and forth on contact tracing. So I'm a huge fan of technology enhanced contact tracing. I think we have tools in our hands that could really help us. The question is, I'm not a public health specialist. I'm not an epidemiologist, but my understanding is you have to have the R factor very low. You have to have you already stopped infection for the most part from happening in the community before you can even do contact tracing. It's a laborious thing. It's a trailing thing that we do. So sometimes I think that we overweigh the benefits and the impact that contact tracing can have right now. Not that we shouldn't be planning to do it in the future, but I would also like to hear from other people. You know, I know contact tracing is a very old school gumshoe thing, you know, clipboards and phone calls and things of that nature, and going out into the community as a local public health official or epidemiologist or you know, surveillance person and gathering that stuff manually. But is it even going to help? Is it even going to help? Is it going to help us address this, contain it, or recover from it? I'm not seeing evidence from other countries or from places in the United States that have low counts that it is efficacious, but I have an open mind about it, because if it is, then I think that we should be having a real serious conversation about balancing privacy, balancing the epidemic, and doing technology enhanced contact tracing.
I mean, I'll ask this question from Anne too, because I think so a lot of companies that worked in telehealth space definitely utilize some of those technologies to at least have constant touch with the patient and maybe even trace back. One thing I would definitely share, especially HP being international, that we have had experience over in South Korea, Taiwan, and other countries in which we caught, Taiwan had experience with SARS. And so they responded really, really quickly, and they caught the pandemic at the stage where testing and contact tracing made sense. And so the case counts that we were just talking about, that made sense. And so putting things in action right away and kept the numbers down. That is when the cat is out of the bag at this point. There is no putting it back in the bag. So I don't think contact tracing is going to be a very effective strategy. And back to your question around telehealth and how it can impact solutions like contact tracing, and then also more like COVID care and other things that, yeah.
Sure. And I think what was missing from the conversation is just all the false negatives or false positives or false negatives that come through with the testing. So it's just wrought with error. I think, again, I referenced the innovation, and the ATA represents over 400 organizations that are in telehealth, including delivery systems, academic medical centers, providers, payers, and then solution providers, starting with the Amwell and Teladoc Healths of the world, to organizations that enable delivery systems like BrightMD and Hypnosis, to organizations that are more AI driven like Babylon Health and Conversa, organizations that are very asynchronous in their approach like Hims and Hers and Row, and organizations like Livongo and Vivify, which are very focused on remote monitoring. And then we also have a number of organizations like HP, for example, that are really the enablers of all this and believe that high water floats all boats. So it gives me a fun and very different vantage point in terms of what's happening. And again, I referenced the innovation. One of our newest members, BioIntelliSense, which is headed by a guy named Jim Malt, who, among many things in his career, include time at Qualcomm. He had started with a sensor remote device that was placed on patients and created, FDA approved, and created what they call the bio button, which is about the size of a dime, which is something that people would adhere to their skin and basically used for 90 days continuous tracking. Talk about personalized medicine. Again, the thing that you all know, because you're clinicians, I am not, is that the temperature, 98.6 is sort of not everybody. And so coming up with personalized readings of body temperature, heart rate, respiration rate, these are all things that can be, monitored, and then individuals can be flagged. And so what they've also done is anticipated that contact tracing is going to have issues as it relates to privacy. And so they have this capability without the geolocation elements to it. So I'm really encouraged by that, because I also have learned from our members, many of whom are clinicians, that there's no new normal we're going back to, no normal that was in the past, that our lives are quite changed and are going to be quite different. And it's going to require a multi-layered approach, like these remote devices, like masks, like other, precautionary measures that we take. I think that your previous panel with Leslie, what they're doing at Livongo in terms of monitoring people with chronic conditions, I have to say that the remote monitoring has really been phenomenal in terms of how it's been used and what it's done, because at the end of the day, people are still scared. There are a lot of folks who are really scared and really not comfortable going to their clinician's office, not going to the hospital for different services. And so what things like Livongo or services like Livongo do is to, and they use the expression all the time, is to meet people where they are. And that, I think, is something that we've seen a huge surge in as well. So very, a lot of innovation and a lot of different companies who are, doing quite a bit. I think there was a partnership that was done with New York Fire Department and I believe with Vivify and Amwell, in fact, where they monitored first responders and basically ensured that they were not developing symptoms. So again, I think that we'll see more and more, and our focus within the ATA is to ensure that the regulations and the statutes and so forth that need to be made permanent, both at a federal and a state level, are done so.
I said at the very start, around noon, when we started this conference, I said that from the public-private perspective, we did really well with telehealth. We deregulated telehealth regulations, and then virtual care just exploded. And we had advances, technological advances in weeks, some months, but the things that probably would have taken a decade. But in the precision medicine and predictive analytics, maybe we're a little bit slow there in the uptick here. So and you talked about remote care, all these remote monitoring systems. Now they can actually maybe identify people with potential symptoms, and which is great. But from the standpoint from what Rajiv is talking about, which is more targeted identification of cases with illnesses as well, that's sort of coming to somewhat precision predictive analytics as well, right? And what kind of technologies are there to be able to identify those, what Rajiv you're looking for?
Well, I'll let Rajiv, I suspect he knows the answer to most of that, so I will defer to him. I will tell you that I think that, again, there are many instances of solutions. You see delivery systems iterating on a dime at this point. They continue to refine their approaches. So you're seeing ICUs being transported into people's homes, or hospitals into people's homes, perhaps not ICUs. So just the whole reconfiguration of how care is delivered is really stunning. So.
Rajiv, can you unmute yourself here? I think you're, yes.
Got it. Yeah, just, so just a quickly, and one, we're not producing hospital admission. This was a crisis about hospitalizations. We're not producing hospital admission rates at any kind of resolved geographic scale. That should be, that is simple. That's yesterday's data, yesterday's technology. HHS asked hospitals to produce that months ago. They're throwing up their IT obstacles. They're saying they're being offended, all of sorts of things. You're not doing bread and butter stuff, and we're talking about going on to the next level of data. And That's astounding. That should be out there first. It is not. There is no magic in getting all of the EHR companies to simply write a script that puts the pneumonias with COVID positive out there tomorrow. So we have fine-grained, we know neighborhood level rates of symptomatic illness from COVID everywhere and respond to where the problem is. It's atrocious that we're not there yet. That's thing one. I think the other point here, and it relates, I'll just take the contact tracing, the problem. We need public-private partnerships, but if the private needs to be told what the problem is honestly. If we're telling people the problem is contact tracing, and then we get all these industries to sort of figure out the contact tracing solution, and then we say, oh, by the way, 50% of the infections happen pre-symptomatically, and contact tracing doesn't have any chance of working, and we knew that. We never applied it. We never thought about contact tracing for pandemic flu or anything with pre-symptomatic transmission. Why was this proposed as a false solution? It was never, and as soon as we knew that, we should have said, no, contact tracing is not going to work. And back to the point from the last panel, it's very hard for public health to say, oh, we were wrong, right? And so now industry is trying to solve a problem that's not solved.
Well, I think the public health needs to come clean with people saying, hey, we are flying the plane while we're learning to fly this plane. And it is a novel virus, and there are going to be missteps, and we need to be adjusting around it. If you're not nimble, if you're not flexible in pivoting, then we will continue the wrong path. And so it's okay for public health folks to come out and share that, because like, hey, we were wrong about the masks. We are right today. This is what the data shows, and let's move on from here. Let's reset. Don't go back and say, you told us this, because that's past and this is now, and that doesn't happen. And then on that front also, some of the credibility that gets lost is in the process of like data sharing. So initially we were supposed to report to CDC, then HHS took over, and then it's back to CDC. And that creates so much muddling of trust from the healthcare providers. Like we now feel like we're flying the plane by ourselves, and like the pilot has left the building. The question for Ed, do you really think that that whole process of posturing around HHS taking on the data and then giving it back to CDC was somewhat of a right decision? And again, it comes to healthcare and politics.
I think it's somewhat of a canard. I think it was a smokescreen, it was all started by Politico, by one guy at Politico, who will remain nameless, who was using, was trying to gin up political clickbait. And when the reality of it is, it's a much more complex thing that needs to be unpacked to understand kind of the root cause of why you had to go through that. And I'm sorry you did, because I think it's unnecessary and it's unfortunate. I think it was Joel White was talking earlier about the fact that there's been multiple legislation over the years. Let's set aside meaningful use legislation. Okay, we all know about that. That was that was we'll just set that aside.
Yes.
But there three times Congress created these laws called All Hazards Preparedness Acts, right? It was in 06, 2013, and 2019. And each time they went and they instructed the CDC to set up a gateway system to connect to all of the state-based systems that are out there, all the state-based health surveillance systems, as well as providers, labs, and physicians' offices, and also going all the way down to the local health departments. Not one time did they obey Congress and get that done. You can look it up. I mean, there was no accountability. Shame on Congress and the GAO. Look, I had to go testify in front of GAO and in front of Congress about things like cybersecurity, and am I doing a good job shifting all of the systems across HHS to the cloud, which was one of the goals, you know, and things of that nature. But there's never really been an unpacking of the why associated with that. So if we had an all hazards database or a gateway, you would not have to experience any of that, because the data would flow into that programmatically, and there wouldn't be duplicate and triplicate entry issues that were piling on top of our providers in the middle of a pandemic, for goodness sakes. And that's a very unfortunate thing. When I was when I was the CTO at HHS, one of the projects we were actually working on was an all hazards gateway. Another project we were working on, and it's still going today, is an immunization gateway, which is going to become very, very important very quickly. And I hope that it's taken very seriously from a data and IT systems perspective. And those are the types of things where we need industry's help in a big way, because we need to do a go fast on this. And when you try and do something fast in government, it can get really messy, and it can lead to big failure. Let's look at the Obamacare website as an example of that. And when government tries to do it without the specialists in industry who do this day in and day out, they know what agile development is, they know what DevOps is, they know all the latest, greatest methodologies to develop something like this. If we do that without those folks, it's going to fail. So right now we're in a quagmire, and it's unfortunate. What has to happen is we need a we need a data hub like HHS Protect, which unfortunately is very manual in nature. There's a lot of manual uploads happening from hospital systems and so forth. But it needs to be a meta or a roll-up type data system that can accept feeds in from all of those organizations that I mentioned to you. At the same time, and to build on what Rajiv said earlier, I'm not letting the providers off the hook on this, nor am I letting the software companies off the hook that have been in this industry since day one and got $40 billion of taxpayer money to do what? To make that data and those data systems interoperable. There's no excuse for it. There's no excuse for it. We just had a new piece of legislation come out called the 21st Century Cures Act.
Yes.
That hopefully, finally, is going to solve this issue, because it speaks specifically around information blocking. And so just like you have a penalty for a HIPAA violation, you're going to have penalties associated with data blocking. And patients, this is patient directed. And if you block data from a patient, if you're a telehealth company and you have a customer or a patient using an app, a telehealth provider, a modality app or something of that nature, and that person can't get their information in a standardized way using what we call an API, you will be penalized. I said this in the interview that I did for Vator News, but I wish we would have had this conversation, and I wish we would have enacted the 21st Century Cures Act about 24 months before the pandemic was known about, because we could have put the pedal to the metal. This could have been a forcing function, just like it was for telehealth. And it's been a great clarion call for telehealth. And we could have, if we just would have been out in front of this even 6 months earlier, we would have been able to pressure the industry to say, look, first of all, I'm a free market guy, okay? But if you're going to take $40 billion of our money and do what you call meaningful use, where these healthcare providers have to attest that they're meaningfully using the stuff that they were asked to do, and you're taking that money, you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to encourage and support and promote the liberation of patient data, especially when it comes to public health.
Yes, put that in the hands of the patient. So when they are in Nebraska and they catch a cold and they've just gotten a test done and whatever it is, like the care does not get interrupted because the data is sitting with their doctor in some archaic system. But I could talk more about that because the 2021 is coming. Everybody needs to comply. They're putting the lipstick on the pig on all of their little homegrown projects. Electronic health record, whether it's as good as Epic to as bad as I got Cerner, whatever it is, all of those are rapidly running to that race, but everybody's putting the lipstick on the pig. They will look like they're complying, but it is, as a clinician, I could just say that it's really not happening. I don't know, Rajiv, what are you seeing at the VA level?
Well,
I'm not
they
optimistic.
the companies, I'll give them a little bit of credit here and say that I do know that they are diligently trying to open up.
Mm-hmm.
There is this U.S. Clinical data set, US CDS or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in there, some very important things, including notes, unstructured notes that need to be surfaced in a meaningful way, frictionless through an API. And it's a pretty wide data set. And fortunately, I can speak for Epic, I can't speak for Epic and Cerner, but I know that they're both technically able to care for the requirements today.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they do.
Now,
they do.
there's
it's willful.
It's willful.
It's willful both on the part of hospital systems, Kaisers. Nobody wants to share, nobody wants to expose. It's simply willful, and ultimately it's a product of our fragmented healthcare delivery system, and that ultimately probably is going to be the only thing that fixes it. Is an unfragmented healthcare system. Back to COVID, I think, I really think that that something we've been, sort of a thread here. You have the groups like Google, Alphabet that can do so much, right? You have all these groups that can do so much, but if they were given and they jumped, for example, on the testing issue, right, early. But if they're given the wrong problem to solve, right, then it just becomes kind of a sort of a distraction and a kind of a setup, and that's what's been really, the lack of. We've just not been operating scientifically here, kind of at all, at so many levels, and every solution has turned out to be kind of a false promise. And I want to bring one point and because we're coming into winter flu season. Well, there was a study called the EPIC study, and not related to the software company, that the CDC did a few years back, and they looked at a large number of hospital admissions for pneumonia, and in that study, only in 38% of cases was a diagnosis made. 32 or 38, something, a small number. Was there a biological diagnosis made? Of the 38%, 2/3 were viral, and with pneumonia, with respiratory syncytial virus being the #1 cause. There's a whole set of communicable viral diseases, just like coronavirus, that's causing the known set. The unknown, 70% or 60-70% of pneumonias, they're unknown. They're likely to be viruses that we don't have a test for. So this is where what are we going to do? Is everything going to be, how are we going to differentiate, or do we need to differentiate? Are we going to, COVID from all the other respiratory viruses that are transmitted in the same way, cause the same problem? Do we want to stop them all? Do we want to stop just COVID? Right? I mean, I think these are kind of Are we going to react differently to different people? These are actually some of the problems that are kind of coming up that we need to sort of figure out and try to solve.
There's a couple things. I know that some people have some questions that I want to get to, but I also want to bring in Damika here because she has, she's working with Verily, Google's Verily, the only technology company, well, besides Ed's company. But and Damika works on the policy side, so she's working with a lot of city and state government. So sort of based on what I'm hearing from Rajiv and Ed is sort of this real disconnect or this very moving target here from the policy side. When how much is politics getting in the way of Verily trying to get their job done? So how often is the goal shifting, and that makes it difficult for you to actually try to find a solution?
Yeah, great question. And listening to Rajiv and Ed, talk about the public-private partnership and the private part of it reacting to the public is really what we've done, right? As the first step was our community-based testing sites in California, and of course expanded across the country through our partnership with Rite Aid, and iterating on those from drive-through models to assisted account models. And then, now we in addition to that, we have this Healthy at Work tool that does have a testing component, but also has, a symptom component to it. And we are reacting to, like it's been said, we are reacting to our public partners. I mean, a strength of working with companies like Verily is that we move very quickly, and we can continue to move quickly, but within the bounds of law and policy, and working and relying on these public partners to help shift how we develop this technology to support the pandemic going forward.
I think working for Verily, you can't get very political.
I would just like to say that Verily did a great job helping us combat the opioid epidemic, and it seems like we've all forgotten about that now. But we held a codathon that was a 2-day event, and it was to really promote public-private partnership and hacktivism, if you will, around the opioid epidemic. And Alphabet fielded a great team, and what came out of that was a true partnership with the Secretary's office around using the Google Maps API and embedding, if you were to Google drug take-back site, so if you're done with controlled substance and you don't want it in your house, you're not supposed to flush it down the toilet, you're supposed to take it to a take-back site, and that was a policy recommendation. And literally in a few hours, the team from Google came up with a way that they could leverage the data that we were providing them about the drug take-back sites, which actually had been surfaced from the states and localities and rolled out. And they had taken their data, including geo data and things of that nature, and a couple of their APIs. And literally, if you go into Google now, I'm pretty sure it still works, and you look for a drug take-back site, one of the first things you get back is Google Maps. You click on Google Maps, and it's got them mapped out for you. And that's an example of great public-private partnership.
I was going to end it with that to show a good example of a great public-private partnership. So, but it is 4:35, and we can go around, and we can all end with, where have we seen that? Like Ed shared, where have we seen a really good public-private partnership for COVID? And
we can begin with here.
So the best evidence or best example I have was early on in the pandemic, where there was an interest in putting together a website that would have resources for clinicians and for consumers. And so rather than create something brand new, we, in collaboration with the CTA, the Consumer Technology Association, put up a website, did a call to all of our members and the industry at large. And it was, hosted at .gov, some part of it, but it was very satisfying because we could get it out fast and we knew it was used by a lot of people. So that's one example.
Excellent. How about you, Damika? Yeah.
You know, when I look at what we did do early with testing, we had some really strong partnerships with the city of San Francisco to figure out a way to utilize our technology with the population that is unhoused, underhoused, or has limited ability to reach the internet or have an account in which they could sign up for a test. So some of our strongest partnerships were servicing the populations in the Tenderloin area of San Francisco to make sure that they were able to test the number of residents who are unhoused, or partnering with San Mateo County, understanding that the county has diverse topography, and utilizing low tech, being RVs, and taking the RVs around the county to ensure testing. So some of those public-private partnerships on the city and county levels served well in the beginning when we were in the testing phase.
Excellent, thank you. How about you, Rajiv? Where do you see public-private partnership besides VA?
Yeah, I don't, a successful public-private partnership with COVID, I haven't observed, unfortunately. One I think we've seen, I think the VA has done a number of amazing things as kind of a very integrated institution that within our walls we've been mission oriented and getting the job done, and kept the veterans in the nursing homes safe. We're the earliest to do kind of universal screening of all of our workers. It just, we fully, when we submit a case report, it has all the exposure information on it. So it's an integrated system that works.
That's great. You were able to accomplish what NBA accomplished, right? Having your own little bubble there. Esther, you're next on my screen. Where is a great public-private partnership that you have experienced, COVID or non? And you're on mute.
The Commons Project, which is sort of backboned out of the Rockefeller Foundation that I'm on the advisory board of, is doing some really interesting work internationally, and they're doing a kind of Common Pass, which is a privacy protected, verification. There's all kinds of issues around coercion and employment status and so forth, but nobody's going to argue that you should be able to take a test and have a record of that test that's validated in order to get on an airplane or cross a border and possibly show up someplace. Privacy is always mediated by how dangerous you are. And I'll be brief because it's the end of an amazingly wonderful day. So I just want to thank everybody. It was great, all the different opinions.
That's awesome. Thank you, Esther, joining in the whole session. Hey, Ed, what about you? Yes.
There's a question here to, were you going to go to Ed? Because there's a question here to Rajiv. I don't know if you can see that on the chat. So I don't want to just dismiss that question, but if you want to answer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think there's a comment for Rajiv's comment that actually builds upon it and says there's a lot of clinical utility to identify which virus is causing the pneumonia, because we didn't have specific or effective treatments. Knowing that outside influenza and at times RSV would not change care. With COVID and the attempts to have treatments aimed specifically to COVID, it changes the utility of checking for specific pathogen in a viral pneumonia or atypical pneumonia scenario. However, as you know, that the data for these COVID treatments is not mature itself. So yes, I do understand, like if you have to decide for remdesivir or not, like you want to know the test results before you can actually implement the treatment. Rajiv, what do you think? You're on mute.
Yeah. So I just want to. I've been talking from a public health hat. So what is the utility of the test? I mean, certainly when people are in a clinical situation in a hospital and they have a pneumonia and they're potentially going to be in ICU, yes, you want to test them. You want to use every test and try to figure out whether they have a treatable diagnosis or not. You want to be doing studies on people who don't have a recognized pathogen. Maybe we'll start trying different experimental treatments on non-recognized pathogens, assuming they're a virus, and maybe there's a generic treatment. So I think that's one path or question. The thing that I'm focused on is that if you have a virus where 50% of the transmission is before symptoms develop and less than 30% of the people have symptoms, there is no value. There's almost no value in testing from a prevention standpoint. And so that is from contact tracing or whatever. Your rule is if you have symptoms of a respiratory virus infection, isolate yourself, right? Maybe there does need to be study on how long do you need to isolate, when do you do secondary transmission, but we've given people a misperception about testing, and that's been damaging. It's going to get more complicated when a virus season comes up. That was I think that was where I was where I was trying to get to.
Yeah. There's one more question that is, can speakers address to what they see as next steps for what is done with all the information that's collected when it's abnormal? What are the assumptions of adaptations or evolution required by the human resource in the healthcare sector, specifically clinicians? What I interpret from this question is like, what happens as maybe clinicians, you are taking care of patients, you're asymptomatic, does abnormal tests matter at that point? And I do believe that different rules apply to clinicians and nurses who are working with patients, just like, there's more tuberculosis and hepatitis B screening, and that happens for clinicians. So is COVID, I believe. Questions for maybe Rajiv again at this point.
Can you just rephrase that? Just restate it one more time?
Can speakers address what they see as next step for what is done with all the information collected when it is abnormal, which is the test is abnormal? And what are assumptions or adaptations required by HR in the healthcare sector, specifically for clinicians?
Are we talking about it like a positive molecular test?
Yes, positive molecular test. That's
so I think it's a good general question that I think that the public really needs to understand, that if you have a positive molecular test, it means that you were exposed sometime in several weeks ago. If you're if we are giving a person a test and we don't know when they were symptomatic, if they didn't have a clinical syndrome of a viral syndrome a few days ago, then it's likely that test doesn't really have any meaningful interpretation. It's out of context, and you could have been infected a couple of days ago and you have no symptoms, or you could have been infected a couple of weeks ago, and then you can't really make a very practical or meaningful recommendation from that. So that gets back to this idea of universal, what are the and maybe that's why I was raising the idea of so many viruses that cause things just like coronavirus, but what are the universal precautions we might want to adopt during respiratory viral season, low tech, that protect the most people, right? I mean, do doctors in hospitals wear masks even if they do get the flu vaccine, right? That's the kind of thing that, that could have a very big impact. And it may be where we maybe it's one of the things, the ideas that come out of this whole episode with COVID that we kind of pursue.
Yeah. Awesome. So Ed, the same question, when and where did you see good private-public partnership? And then I will send it back to Bambi, and then I have one to share.
So right about the time I was tendering my resignation, I walked in on a very interesting meeting with the high ups at HHS, and somebody was talking to a large manufacturer of medical goods, talking to the CEO and saying, we need your help, you know, and this was actually, this would have been end of January. And we need your help. We need to partner with you. We need to start manufacturing more masks and things of that nature. You need to turn your production over to that effort, not give it to the federal government, but turn over the equipment, if you will, so that they can do that. There are probably, I don't exaggerate, there are probably 40 or 50 public-private partnerships where HHS or another part of the federal government, running from the VA to DARPA to various components of HHS, where industry has stepped up in a very, very big way because they felt a calling to do so. And for that, I'm personally very appreciative. Then you have good examples of us getting out in front of immunization as much as we can. So whether it's AbbVie, Amgen, Merck, Lilly, Abbott, Pfizer, Roche, all of these types of organizations, all the big pharma companies have stepped up. A lot of them very quietly so, and they're participating in trials, so we would expect them to be quiet about that. But and have put more at risk, I would say, than they normally would. And there are certain instances where it doesn't necessarily equate to risk, where the federal government has said, hey, we're going to go ahead and start manufacturing promising vaccines in advance so that we can have enough of the vaccine should it pass trial, things of that nature, which is pretty unorthodox for a lot of the manufacturers. So there are really three things that that NIH specifically that they're really looking to do, and speed up the preclinical evaluation methodologies and things like that. Work very closely with industry to do those things. FDA to prioritize and accelerate therapeutic candidates, et cetera. So too many to mention. And what I find is really interesting is we don't really talk about this. The public really doesn't know about all of the companies, large to small, that have really stepped up to the plate in a big way to partner with the federal government, and in a lot of respects put their businesses at some modicum of risk in doing so.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Bambi, what do you got?
Well, I'm not as much of an expert as everybody here, but I think I mentioned that I think where I thought the public and private sector as well was around telehealth. So we saw deregulation, then we saw an explosion of virtual care, and I think everyone from the telehealth industry has stepped up. But I think that's been around for, even the American Telemedicine Association's been around for 25 years, so they've been working on that type of technology for a long time. I think we're, again, with the precision medicine, I'm sorry, you didn't ask where it didn't work out well. And this is sort of where Rajiv came in, because I guess he said that he didn't have any specific examples where he saw it work well, but in the precision medicine or predictive analytics. And I think this is where the politics come into place, unfortunately, because I don't think if we don't get around what our goals are, and if we can't align ourselves in goals, then we're constantly shifting and looking up, going down different rabbit holes. So I don't think that was a challenge for the private sector and I'm not saying this is a government problem. I think it's more of it's a narrative problem that were perpetuated given how connected we are with the media and social media and all of that. I think there's a disinformation problem that made it really difficult for the private sector to work with the public sector, unfortunately.
Yeah.
If I can just build on that for a second, I think we have a data problem. You can't manage what you can't measure, as Edward Stimming said, and I would further that by saying you can't improve what you can't manage, and we are in an unmanageable situation in many respects, because when we're talking about the direct addressing what is in front of us today, because we're dealing with spotty information, we're dealing with conflicting information in a lot of instances, and we're dealing with late information. Where information is trickling in. We're seeing corrections of the major databases, which are substantive corrections, by the way, in a lot of instances. The other thing I want to mention here is there are things we can all disagree on, and there are things we can agree on. And to build on Esther's earlier comments, we need to focus on wellness and prevention in this country. This should be not only a clarion call for telehealth, right? That the telehealth is useful here. Prevention and wellness is useful here. This is a case study in it. Why? Because the people that are ending up in the hospital have comorbidities, okay? Almost every single one of them. Rajiv, you could probably give me the figures here, but that is why we've seen an uptake in our apps, which are wellness and longevity apps that are predicated on data and science, is because people are picking this up in the media and saying, wait a second, I'm a little overweight, I'm pre-diabetic, and I'm a cigarette smoker. I better get my act together. And so we're seeing, I think, an uptake in, especially on our fasting stuff. It's kind of mind-blowing, the hockey stick of uptake that we've seen. So we need to have a really serious conversation as we're, talking about this, about wellness and prevention.
Just taking it. So a big part of our problem, for following on that, is we have is a transparency problem. It's the data. The data has not been put out, has not been shared. The studies haven't been done that are needed. There has been confusion and uncertainty that's kind of reigned. So what are this? And the problem here is that government owns this is disease control data, and the 19th century model of government owning controlling this. So what might be, how do you, I think going forward, what laws do need, so this data is not, there needs to be ways for people to verify the facts. Does industry need to develop its own tools to its own science to maybe not replicate what government does, but to verify what government does if government's not going to verify it itself? There's minimum sort of open data standards for when you have a pandemic, so people can verify rules that are being imposed on them and the necessity for them. There is a set of public health ethics, and there's a list of what you have to do to have an ethical rule. Every single one of those rules has been violated.
And
well, I don't want to end on.
But we don't want to end on. And
we don't want to end on doom and gloom here.
No, many good public-private partnerships in my lifetime, and I didn't. And I answered. My answer really had to do with, have I seen that in COVID? And I'm sorry I'm being so sort of negative or cynical, or but we have to fix this.
Well, the other clinician on the panel, I would say that I have seen a couple, and which are really mind-blowing. One is how each of the states opened up their boundaries for other licensures to be able to work across the country. I think this is remarkable. What I was able to care for my patients in New York. I was able to care for my colleagues who were not available or were on different time zones and care for the patients. That is remarkable. And the second one is the telehealth. and how CMS was able to really work fast. I've never seen CMS work that fast, and they were able to pass laws which were unprecedented to support. So the states worked hard and the CMS worked hard to provide access to people. And I think that's really phenomenal what we did, especially thanks to COVID in a way. So with that positive note, I know that Ed was about to say something. Was it positive or part of the doom and gloom?
I've since forgotten, but
Okay.
I would say that the interstate licensure issues, reciprocity of licensure, and telehealth go hand in hand. In fact, the major burning issue for the telehealth community for the last 10 to 15 years was exactly that, right? We need to break down these false geographical boundaries associated with old school care so that we can do a better job caring for patients using technology. And I'm very, very hopeful. I'm very bullish and hopeful for telehealth, but we need to be vigilant on this because a lot of the things that you're talking about are merely temporary, especially around CMS. And Administrator Verma had a lot of courage to do what she did, but there's going to come a point in time when Congress comes calling and GAO comes calling and CBO, the budget office, Congressional Budget Office comes calling to say, wait a second, this is a trust fund, right? Medicare is a trust fund. You can't play with those rules without going through Congress. You can during an emergency. So what I'm going to encourage everybody to do is talk to their members of Congress and be a part of advocacy on this because it affects all of us. Everyone that's in health IT, everyone that's in IT, we're bringing these barriers down and once and for all getting rid of them is super important.
Absolutely. With that note, Bambi, it's a wrap.
It's a wrap.
It's a wrap. Thank you, everyone.
Thank everyone for spending 5 hours with us. Some of you for spending that much time. We are going to have this out on video so you can access it again. And wow, hopefully we solve some problems. I don't know, it's still a problem, but thank you for all of you, very smart and insightful folks from different sectors and just to give everyone some insight. So Archana and I will be back doing this again the next quarter, so we'll let you know when that will be, and we'll send an email out to alert everyone when the videos are up as well. So with that, everyone stay safe and have a very good evening.
Yes, and mask
And
up.
thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.